Some mistakes don't ruin your life immediately, they wait. And by the time they catch up to you, there's no escape. The question is, how far can one decision really follow you? Welcome back to Mr. Leo's Endless Stories, my wonderful family and friends. If you're already feeling pulled into this story, take a moment to subscribe and join our growing storytelling family. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. New emotional and powerful stories are waiting for you, and you definitely don't want to miss the next one. Now, let us begin. James Miller had everything a man could want, and nothing that could quiet his mind. From the outside, his life looked like a flawless blueprint of success, the kind people envied without understanding the cost. His name carried weight in rooms he hadn't even entered yet. His company dominated headlines. His wealth spoke before he ever had to. But none of that followed him into the silence. He stood in his office, high above the city, staring through glass that reflected his own image back at him. Sharp suit, controlled expression, a man who looked like he had mastered life itself. He adjusted his cuffs slightly, a small habit, a need for precision. Everything in his world had to be exact, predictable, contained, especially emotions. His phone buzzed behind him, breaking the stillness. He didn't turn right away. People always waited for him. That was the rule. That was the power. After a moment, he picked it up, already knowing who it was. The message was simple. Dinner tonight? Or are you too busy being untouchable again? No name. He didn't need one. Vanessa. A slow smile formed. Not warm, not soft, but something sharper. Vanessa didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask where she stood. She existed outside of expectations, and maybe that was why he kept going back. She made him feel something he couldn't define, something reckless. Without thinking too deeply, because thinking too deeply was dangerous, he typed, 8 p.m. That was all. No explanation, no apology, just a decision. He set the phone down and turned back to the window, unaware that this one simple message was another quiet step toward a life he wouldn't be able to control. Across the city, Laura Miller stood in her kitchen, staring at a clock that seemed louder than usual. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't late. Not technically, but it felt late. Because she had been waiting. Dinner sat on the table, untouched. Steam had long faded into the air, leaving behind the faint smell of something that used to be warm. She had cooked his favorite. Again, not because he asked. He rarely asked for anything anymore. But because she remembered. Because she still believed that small things mattered, even if he didn't notice them anymore. Laura gently placed a glass of water beside his empty seat, her movements quiet, careful, like she was trying not to disturb something fragile, or maybe something already broken. She glanced at her phone. Nothing. No message. No call. Just silence. The kind that grows heavier the longer you sit with it. She exhaled slowly and pulled out her chair, sitting down across from the space where he should have been. The chair looked wrong without him. Too empty. Too honest. For a moment, she let herself imagine that the door would open, that he'd walk in, loosen his tie, give her that tired but familiar smile, the one he used to give her before everything changed. But the door stayed closed, and reality settled in again. Laura reached for her fork, then stopped. She wasn't hungry. Not really. It wasn't food she needed. It was something she didn't know how to ask for anymore. She stood up again, unable to sit still, and began clearing the table even though it hadn't been touched. Each movement felt heavier than it should have, like she was cleaning up more than just dinner, like she was quietly erasing expectations. Back in the city, James stepped into the restaurant, the kind of place where everything was dimly lit and deliberately exclusive. The air carried soft music, clinking glasses, low conversations, and attention. People noticed him. They always did. But he didn't notice them. His eyes found Vanessa instantly. She sat by the window, dressed in deep red, the color catching the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore her. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Late, she said as he approached, though her tone carried amusement rather than annoyance. I'm here, James replied, taking his seat across from her. That was enough for him. Presence over explanation. Vanessa leaned back slightly, studying him. You ever get tired? She asked. Of what? Being this version of yourself all the time. James didn't answer immediately, because the question didn't fit into his world. He wasn't used to being asked things that didn't have clear, efficient answers. No, he said finally. Vanessa smiled, but there was something knowing in it. Of course not. Because men like James didn't question their lives. They built them, controlled them, dominated them. At least, that's what they believed. Across the city, Laura stood by the sink, her hands resting against the counter as she stared out into the dark. Her reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Not because she had changed physically, but because something inside her had shifted. Quietly, slowly, without permission. She picked up her phone again, her fingers hesitating just for a moment before unlocking it. She didn't search for messages. She already knew there were none. Instead, her eyes landed on something else. A notification, a charge, from a restaurant she recognized. Not because she had been there recently, but because James had mentioned it once. A place for important meetings. Her chest tightened, not sharply, not dramatically, but in a slow, sinking way. Two people, a table for two. The time matched. Everything matched, except the truth she had been avoiding. Her grip on the phone tightened slightly. And in that moment, something inside her didn't shatter. It settled. Like a realization finally finding its place. Back at the restaurant, James let out a quiet laugh at something Vanessa said. It was rare, genuine, unfiltered. And for a moment, he felt lighter, freer, like the version of himself sitting across from her didn't carry expectations, didn't carry responsibility, didn't carry history. Vanessa leaned closer, her voice softer now. Stay a little longer tonight. It wasn't a request. It was an invitation. One he didn't hesitate to accept. All right, he said. And just like that, another line was crossed. Without hesitation. Without consequence. At least, not yet. Miles away, Laura turned off the kitchen light. The house fell into darkness, except for the faint glow from the hallway. She didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she walked slowly toward the bedroom, each step steady, controlled. As if she had already made a decision, she wasn't ready to speak out loud. Something had changed tonight, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. And somewhere between that quiet house and that glowing restaurant, two lives were already beginning to move toward a collision neither of them was ready for. Have you ever waited for someone to show up, not just physically, but emotionally, and realized they stopped trying long before you stopped hoping? Share in the comments. The night didn't end at dinner. It never did. For James, nights like this had become an escape. Carefully chosen, carefully hidden, and dangerously addictive. The city outside blurred into streaks of light as his car moved through the quiet streets. Inside, the silence between him and Vanessa wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy with something neither of them needed to define. Vanessa sat beside him, her heels discarded on the floor, her body angled slightly toward him, not touching, but close enough to feel. You're quiet tonight, she murmured. James kept his eyes forward. I'm thinking. That's new. A faint smirk touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not everything needs commentary. Vanessa studied him for a moment, then leaned her head back against the seat. You ever feel guilty? The question landed harder than it should have. James didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple, because guilt required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required something he wasn't ready to give. No, he said finally. But his voice lacked its usual certainty. Vanessa didn't push. She didn't need to, because deep down, she already knew the answer wasn't as clean as he wanted it to be. The elevator ride up to her apartment was silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was inevitable. When the doors opened, Vanessa walked ahead, unlocking the door without looking back. James followed. The moment he stepped inside, the world outside disappeared. Soft lighting, warm tones, the faint scent of vanilla and something deeper, something almost intoxicating. It didn't feel like his world, and maybe that was the point. Vanessa turned to face him, her expression unreadable for just a second before it softened. You can still leave, she said quietly. It wasn't a test. It was truth, a final door. James looked at her, really looked at her, at the way she stood there, not fragile, not desperate, but open. And then something inside him made a choice, not out of love, not out of clarity, but out of desire, out of escape, out of the need to feel something different from the controlled emptiness he had grown used to. I don't want to leave, he said. And that was the moment everything changed. Across the city, Laura sat on the edge of her bed, still holding her phone. The screen had gone dark, but she hadn't moved. Her mind replayed the same detail over and over again. That restaurant, that charge, that time. Two people. Her chest felt tight, not like it was breaking, but like something inside her was slowly closing, like a door shutting quietly. She stood up, almost mechanically, and walked toward the closet. Inside, everything was organized. Neat, predictable, just like her life used to feel. Her fingers brushed against one of James's shirts hanging there. She paused. The fabric was familiar, soft, worn in the way things become when they've been part of your life for years. She lifted it slightly, bringing it closer, not to smell it, not to hold it tightly, but just to feel it. And suddenly, memories came rushing in. Late-night conversations, lazy Sunday mornings, the way he used to look at her like she was the only person in the room. When did that stop? When did she stop being enough? Laura placed the shirt back carefully, not angrily, not dramatically, just deliberately, like she was putting something away for the last time. She walked to the mirror and looked at herself, really looked. Her reflection didn't look broken. It didn't look weak. It looked tired, but there was something else there too. Something new. Something that hadn't been there before. Clarity, painful, unavoidable clarity. Meanwhile, in Vanessa's apartment, the distance between choices and consequences disappeared completely. James had always believed he could separate parts of his life, business from emotion, marriage from desire, control from chaos. But in that moment, those lines blurred beyond recognition. Vanessa's laughter filled the room, soft, genuine, unrestrained. It was different from anything he heard at home, different from anything he allowed himself to feel. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about responsibility. He wasn't thinking about consequences. He wasn't thinking about Laura. And that was the most dangerous part of all. Because forgetting her was easier than facing what he was doing to her. Hours later, the city had gone quiet. Lights dimmed, streets emptied, and reality slowly began to creep back in. James stood by the window in Vanessa's apartment, buttoning his shirt. The silence now felt different, heavier. Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. "Are you going to tell her?" she asked. The question cut through everything. James didn't turn around. No, simple, cold, final. Vanessa nodded slowly, though something flickered in her eyes, something almost like disappointment. "Then what am I to you?" she asked quietly. That question he didn't answer, because answering it would mean defining something he wasn't ready to define. And James didn't like things he couldn't control. "I should go," he said instead. Vanessa let out a soft breath, not quite a sigh, not quite acceptance. "Of course you should, because that was always the reality." She was the moment, Laura was the life, and James was standing in between, pretending he could have both. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, but because of the silence, the kind that leaves too much room for thought. For the first time that night, Laura crossed his mind, not as an obligation, not as a routine, but as a question. What would she say if she knew? The thought lingered, uncomfortable, unwanted. He pushed it aside, because that's what he did best: avoid, suppress, move forward. When he finally walked through the front door, the house was dark, still, quiet. Laura was asleep. Or at least, that's what he assumed. He loosened his tie, stepping carefully, as if silence could hide everything he had done. But silence doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. He entered the bedroom quietly. Laura lay on her side, facing away from him, her breathing steady, controlled. James watched her for a moment. Something stirred inside him, not guilt, not fully, but something close enough to feel uncomfortable. He turned away quickly, heading toward the bathroom, because looking at her felt harder than anything he had done that night. Laura's eyes opened the second the bathroom door closed. She hadn't been asleep. Not really. She had heard the door, the footsteps, the careful movements. She didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't speak. Because sometimes silence says more than confrontation ever could. Her eyes stared into the darkness, unblinking, unwavering. And in that moment, something inside her made a quiet promise, not to him, to herself. She would not beg for love. She would not compete for attention. And she would not pretend anymore. In the bathroom, James splashed cold water on his face, gripping the edge of the sink. His reflection stared back at him. For the first time, it didn't look as composed. There was something fractured, barely visible. But there, he exhaled slowly, straightening up, forcing the image back into something familiar, something controlled, something safe. because facing the truth would require something he wasn't ready to give. Honesty. That night, they slept in the same bed, only inches apart. But emotionally, they had never been further, and neither of them said a word. Because the betrayal had already happened, and the silence that followed was just the beginning of everything that would break. Morning came like it always did. Quiet, predictable, unforgiving. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, stretching across the bed in soft golden lines, but it didn't warm anything between them. James woke first. He always did. Routine had trained him that way. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then reality returned. He turned his head slightly. Laura was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, back straight, still, too still. Something about the way she held herself made the air feel different, tighter, like a room before a storm. "Morning," James said, his voice steady, controlled. Laura didn't turn immediately. "Morning." One word, flat, polite, empty. James sat up slowly, watching her. There was no accusation in her tone, no anger, and somehow, that felt worse. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked. A normal question. A safe question. Laura finally stood, smoothing her shirt as if she were preparing for something far more important than this conversation. "I slept. Not well, not badly. Just slept." James frowned slightly, but he didn't push. He wasn't used to pushing. He was used to control, and right now, he didn't feel entirely in control. In the kitchen, everything looked exactly the same. Clean counters, organized space, coffee brewing. But something invisible had shifted. Laura moved quietly, pouring coffee into 2 cups. She placed one in front of James without looking at him. A simple gesture, one she had done 1,000 times. But today, it felt different, deliberate, measured. James picked up the cup. "Thanks." She nodded once. Still no eye contact. Still no questions. Still no confrontation. And that silence began to press against him. "You were up late," she said finally, her voice calm. Too calm. James took a sip of coffee, buying himself a second. "Work." The lie came easily, too easily. Laura's fingers tightened slightly around her own cup, but only slightly, barely noticeable. "Of course," she said. And that was it. No follow-up, no challenge, just acceptance. But it wasn't real acceptance. It was something else, something colder. James set his cup down, studying her now. "You okay?" There it was, concern, but not quite deep enough, not quite honest enough. Laura finally looked at him. And for a brief second, their eyes met. There was no softness there, no warmth, just distance. "I'm fine." 2 words, carefully chosen, carefully delivered. James held her gaze for a moment longer, as if searching for something familiar, something he recognized. But whatever he was looking for wasn't there anymore. At the office, everything felt easier, cleaner. Numbers made sense. People followed structure. Nothing emotional, nothing unpredictable. James sat at the head of the conference table, listening as his team presented projections and strategies. His attention was sharp, focused, unshaken. This was his world. This was where he thrived. "James?" He blinked, pulling himself back. "Yes." "We need your approval on the expansion deal." He nodded. Approved. No hesitation, no second-guessing. Because business didn't require emotional accountability. It required decisions, and James was very good at making those. Across the city, Laura sat in a quiet cafe, her laptop open but untouched. She wasn't working. She was thinking, replaying, reevaluating. The truth had settled in overnight, not explosively, but with a quiet certainty she couldn't ignore. She knew, maybe not every detail, but enough, more than enough. Her phone lay beside her, screen dark. She hadn't checked it all morning, hadn't looked for messages, hadn't expected any, because expectation required hope, and hope felt dangerous now. A woman at the next table laughed softly, her voice light, carefree. Laura glanced over briefly. For a moment, she wondered what that felt like, to be that unburdened, to love without questioning, to trust without doubt. She looked away, because that version of her felt distant now, almost like someone else entirely. Back at the office, James's phone buzzed again. A message. He glanced down. "Vanessa, last night wasn't just a moment for me." His jaw tightened slightly. He didn't reply immediately, because that message complicated things, and James didn't like complications. Another message followed. "You can't keep pretending this doesn't mean something." He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. This was exactly what he wanted to avoid. emotion, expectation, definition. He typed back, don't overthink it. 3 words. Detached, dismissive, safe, but not honest. Laura returned home earlier than usual. The house greeted her the same way it always did. Quiet, still, unchanged. But she wasn't the same. She walked through each room slowly, not looking for anything specific, but noticing everything. The photos on the wall, the memories frozen in frames, smiles that felt real, moments that once meant everything. Her fingers brushed lightly over one picture. A vacation. Laughter. Love. Or at least what she believed was love. Her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. Not anymore. Instead, she stepped back. And for the first time, she saw the house not as a home, but as a place filled with things that no longer felt true. That evening, James came home earlier than expected. Maybe out of habit. Maybe out of something else he didn't want to define. He found Laura in the living room, sitting quietly with a book she wasn't reading. "You're home early," he said. "So are you." Her tone wasn't accusatory, just observant. James hesitated for a second before sitting across from her. The space between them felt wider than it should have. "How was your day?" he asked. "Productive." Again, simple, controlled. James nodded. "Good." Silence followed. Heavy, unavoidable. And for once, he didn't know how to fill it. Laura closed her book slowly. "James," she said. His name. Not hey. Not silence. His name. It caught his attention immediately. "Yes?" She looked at him, not with anger, not with tears, but with something far more unsettling. Clarity. "Are you happy?" The question landed like a weight. Simple, direct, impossible to answer honestly. James frowned slightly. "What kind of question is that?" "A real one." Her voice remained calm, steady, but underneath it, something was shifting, something final. James leaned back, crossing his arms slightly, a subtle defensive posture. "Of course I am." The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Laura nodded slowly. "Okay." Just one word. But it carried something deeper. Acceptance, not of his answer, but of what his answer revealed. Because she knew. And now, she also knew something else. He wasn't going to tell her. Not the truth. Not on his own. That night, they sat in the same room, spoke in the same calm tones, lived in the same space. But emotionally, they were already walking in opposite directions. James chose denial. Because it was easier. Because it allowed him to keep control. Because it delayed consequences. Laura chose distance. Because it protected her. Because it gave her space to think. Because it was the only way to survive what she now understood. And somewhere between denial and distance, the marriage they once built with love was quietly, steadily beginning to fall apart. The distance between them should have made things easier. It didn't. If anything, it made everything sharper, more noticeable, more suffocating. Because no matter how far apart James and Laura felt emotionally, their lives were still tightly intertwined, and there was no clean way to separate them. 3 days later, that truth became impossible to ignore. "James, we have a situation." The urgency in his assistant's voice was enough to make him stop mid-step. "What kind of situation?" he asked, already sensing something wasn't right. "Board level." That was enough. James turned immediately, striding back into his office. "Explain." "There's been a sudden withdrawal from one of our major investors." And she hesitated slightly. "They're not the only one." James's expression hardened. "That's not possible." "It's happening." She handed him the report. Numbers, losses, movement, all of it pointed to one thing: instability. His company, his empire, was shifting beneath him, and not in a way he could easily control. At home, Laura received the call just as she was about to step out. "Mrs. Miller, we need you to come in." Her father's voice, calm but serious. "I thought I wasn't involved in the company anymore," she replied quietly. "You're still a major shareholder," he said. "And right now that matters." Laura hesitated. She had stepped away from the business years ago, not because she couldn't handle it, but because James had taken over so completely that there was no space left for her, no need. Or so it seemed. "I'll be there," she said finally, because something told her. This wasn't just about business. The boardroom felt colder than usual. James stood at the head of the table, every inch the leader he had always been. Controlled, sharp, unshaken. But beneath that surface, there was pressure building. Laura walked in quietly. The room shifted the second she entered. Not dramatically, but noticeably. because even after everything, her presence carried weight. James looked up, their eyes met, and for a split second, everything unsaid between them filled the room. Then it disappeared, just as quickly. "You're here," he said. "Yes." Nothing more, nothing less. The meeting began. Voices filled the room. Analysts, board members, advisors, all speaking in careful tones, trying to manage a situation that was quickly slipping beyond control. "Investor confidence is dropping," one man explained. "We need to stabilize the narrative," another added, "or we risk a full collapse." James listened, calculated, adapted. "This is temporary," he said firmly. "We've handled worse." But even as he said it, he knew this was different, because this wasn't just numbers. This was trust. And trust, once shaken, was far harder to rebuild. Laura sat quietly, listening, observing, not interrupting, but seeing everything. The tension, the cracks, the subtle panic beneath controlled voices, and James, still trying to hold everything together like nothing was slipping. It was strange. She used to admire that about him, his ability to stay composed. Now, it felt like distance, like he was still refusing to face something real. Halfway through the meeting, a new detail emerged, one that changed everything. The primary investor who pulled out, the analyst hesitated, has ties to a competing firm. James frowned. "Which firm?" There was a pause. Then, Harper and Company. The name landed heavily, because Harper & Co. wasn't just a competitor. It was aggressive, strategic, and very, very interested in acquisition. Laura's posture shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough, because she knew that name. "Very well," James noticed. "Something you want to say?" he asked. All eyes turned to her. Laura met his gaze. Calm, steady. "I know them." The room grew quieter. "How?" James asked. "My father used to partner with them years ago," she replied. "Before you expanded the company." A subtle reminder of a time before everything became his. "They don't make moves like this without intention," she added. James's jaw tightened slightly. "Meaning?" "Meaning this isn't just pressure," Laura said. "It's positioning." The room absorbed her words, because they weren't emotional. They were precise, strategic, accurate. James leaned back slightly, studying her now, not as his wife, but as something else, an equal, maybe even an advantage. "We need leverage," one board member said. "We need stability," another added. James exhaled slowly. Then, reluctantly, "Laura." He didn't say her name often anymore. Not like that. Not with intention. "I need you involved in this." The words felt strange coming from him. Unfamiliar, because asking wasn't something he did. Laura held his gaze. For a moment, the past flickered between them. All the time she had stood beside him, supported him, believed in him, until he stopped letting her. "What exactly are you asking?" she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a boundary in it now. Clear, defined. James noticed, and for once, he didn't try to override it. "I need your insight," he said. "Your connections. Your understanding of their strategy. Not our company. Not our future. Just what he needed." Laura nodded slowly. "I'll help." A pause. "But this is business." The words carried weight, because they drew a line, a clear separation between what they were and what they used to be. James understood. Even if he didn't fully accept it, from that moment on, they were forced together again. Not by love, not by choice, but by necessity. Meetings turned into long hours turned into late nights, strategy sessions, calls, negotiations. And in every room they entered together, there was tension, unspoken, unresolved, but unavoidable. One evening, after everyone had left, they remained in the conference room, just the two of them, papers scattered, lights dimmed, the city glowing outside. Laura stood by the window, arms crossed lightly. James sat at the table, watching her. "You've changed," he said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Laura didn't turn. "I had to." Simple, honest, sharp. James leaned forward slightly. "You didn't have to shut me out." That made her turn. Finally, her eyes met his. And this time, there was no softness left. "I didn't shut you out, James," she said quietly. "You left." The truth hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. James opened his mouth, maybe to deny it, maybe to explain. But nothing came out, because deep down, he knew she was right. The silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of everything they hadn't said, everything they still weren't saying. And yet, despite the distance, despite the truth, despite the fracture between them, they still had to stand side by side, fight the same battle, protect the same company, because sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of walking away. Sometimes it forces you to face the person you hurt. Every single day, there are truths people avoid not because they are hidden, but because they are too painful to say out loud. It started with something small. A file, misplaced, or maybe discovered. Laura sat alone in James's office late one evening, long after the rest of the building had emptied. The silence felt different here, colder, more deliberate, his space, his world. Or at least, it used to be only his. Papers were spread across the desk, financial reports, investor profiles, risk analyses. She had been reviewing everything carefully, piece by piece, not just as a shareholder, not just as someone helping stabilize the company, but as someone trying to understand how things had unraveled so quickly. Because collapse doesn't happen overnight. It builds, quietly, patiently, like cracks in glass you don't notice until it shatters. She reached for another folder, paused. Something about it felt out of place. It wasn't labeled like the others. No official tag, no structured category, just a simple black cover. Her fingers rested on it for a moment. Then, slowly, she opened it. Inside were receipts, transactions, dates, locations. At first, they didn't mean anything. Until they did. The restaurant. The same one. Again, and again, and again. Her chest tightened slightly, but she didn't stop reading. Hotels, private bookings, gifts, jewelry, travel. Patterns began to form. Clear, undeniable, intentional. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment. It was a choice. Repeated. Over time. Carefully hidden, but not well enough. Laura exhaled slowly, closing the folder halfway. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't fill with tears, but something inside her shifted again. Deeper this time. More permanent. Footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway. She didn't look up. She already knew who it was. James entered a second later, stopping when he saw her at his desk. "What are you still doing here?" he asked. Then he noticed the file. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Laura looked up at him. And in her eyes, there was no confusion anymore. No doubt. Just truth. "How long?" she asked. No accusation. No raised voice. Just a question. Simple, sharp, unavoidable. James didn't answer immediately, because there was no answer that wouldn't make things worse. "Laura, that how long, James?" This time, her voice carried something heavier. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to finality. He exhaled slowly. "A few months." A lie. Not entirely, but not the full truth either. Laura held his gaze, and she knew. She knew it wasn't the whole truth, but she didn't push further, because the details didn't matter anymore. The reality already did. Have you ever asked a question you already knew the answer to, just to see if someone would finally be honest with you? Share in the comments section. She closed the file completely, set it down, carefully. "You didn't even try to hide it well," she said quietly. James frowned slightly. "That's not fair." That made her pause. "Not fair?" she repeated. Not louder, but sharper, more precise. "I trusted you." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional in the way people expect. They were calm, controlled, and that made them hit harder. James ran a hand through his hair, frustration starting to surface. "It's not what you think." There it was, the phrase people use when the truth is exactly what it looks like. Laura let out a small breath. Almost a laugh, but without humor. "Then tell me what it is." He hesitated, because explaining it would mean owning it, and owning it would mean breaking something completely, that it didn't mean anything. He said finally, the worst possible answer, and he didn't even realize it. Laura stared at him for a long moment, and something in her expression changed. Not hurt, not shock, but something quieter, more devastating. "Exactly," she said softly. That one word carried everything, because it told him she understood, and because it told him he had just made everything worse. James stepped closer, his voice lower now. "You're overreacting." The second worst thing he could have said. Laura shook her head slowly. "I'm not reacting at all." And she wasn't. That was the truth. There were no tears, no raised voice, no emotional collapse, just clarity, cold, unshakable clarity. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy, uncomfortable, real. Then Laura did something unexpected. She walked past him. Toward the door, James turned slightly. That's it. She stopped, not turning around. What more is there to say? Her voice was quiet, but firm. James felt something shift inside him, something he didn't like, loss of control. You're just going to walk away? That made her turn, finally. And this time, there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Detachment. I think you already did that, she said. The words landed hard, because they were true, because they couldn't be argued, because deep down, he knew exactly when he had walked away. Long before tonight, she left the office without another word. The door closing behind her sounded louder than it should have. Final. James stood there alone. The room suddenly felt different, too quiet, too still. He looked at the desk, at the file, at the truth he could no longer ignore. And for the first time, he felt it, not just discomfort, not just frustration, but something deeper, something heavier, something dangerously close to regret. But even then, he didn't chase her, he didn't call out, he didn't fix it. Because pride is a powerful thing, and James still believed he had time. That night, Laura didn't go home. Instead, she drove aimlessly through the city. Lights blurred past her, people moved around her, life continued. As if nothing had changed, but everything had. She stopped at a quiet overlook, parking the car and turning off the engine. Silence settled around her. She leaned back in her seat, staring out at the city skyline. For years, she had built her life around one person, one love, one belief. And now, she was sitting here, realizing she had to rebuild everything from scratch. A memory surfaced, clear, uninvited. James, years ago, laughing, looking at her like she was enough, like she was everything. Promise me something, he had said back then. What? She had asked. That no matter what happens, we don't lose each other. She closed her eyes slowly, because the irony was unbearable. They hadn't lost each other. He had let her go. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Quiet, unnoticed, gone as quickly as it came. Because this wasn't about breaking anymore. This was about rebuilding. And somewhere in the city, in a quiet office filled with things he once controlled, James stood alone with a truth he could no longer avoid. He had made a choice. And now, that choice had consequences. The problem was, he still didn't understand just how much it was going to cost him. Some connections don't disappear, even after they're broken. They just change. The next morning, nothing was said about the night before. Not at the office, not in messages, not anywhere. And somehow, that silence felt heavier than any argument. Laura arrived early. Earlier than everyone else. She needed the quiet, not to escape, but to think, to rebuild something inside herself that had cracked open. She stood by the large window in the conference room, watching the city slowly come alive. Cars moved, lights flickered off, people rushed into another day. Life didn't pause for heartbreak. It never did. Couldn't sleep either. James's voice broke the silence. Laura didn't turn immediately. I slept enough. He stepped into the room, slower than usual, less certain. That was new. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt familiar now, but something else was there too. Something softer, not forgiveness, not yet, but something less sharp than before. We have a meeting in an hour, James said. I reviewed your notes. She finally turned. And they were good. Simple. But coming from him, it meant more than it should have. Laura nodded slightly. They were accurate. A pause. Then, unexpectedly. You used to say that, James added. Say what? That accuracy matters more than opinion. She held his gaze for a moment. I still believe that. Their eyes stayed locked just a second longer than necessary. And in that moment, something flickered, not the past, but a memory of it. Later that day, the pressure of the company crisis forced them into the same rhythm again. Meetings, decisions, strategy sessions. And for hours at a time, they worked side by side like nothing had happened. Not because they had moved on, but because they had no choice. At lunch, neither of them left. The office had emptied slightly, leaving behind a quieter atmosphere. Laura sat at the table, reviewing documents. James walked in a few minutes later, carrying 2 coffees. He placed one in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. I didn't ask for this. I know. A beat. But you didn't refuse it either. That earned the smallest shift in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close. She picked up the cup. Thank you. The words felt unfamiliar between them, but not unwelcome. They sat across from each other in silence. But this silence was different, less tense, less defensive, more reflective. Have you ever found yourself reconnecting with someone who hurt you? Not because the pain is gone, but because the connection never fully disappeared? Share in the comments below. You always drink it too hot, James said suddenly. Laura raised an eyebrow slightly. And you always notice things too late. The words landed softly, but the meaning beneath them was anything but. James exhaled quietly, leaning back in his chair. I deserve that. Yes, she said. No hesitation, no sugarcoating, but also no cruelty, just truth. For the first time in a long time, James didn't try to defend himself, didn't argue, didn't redirect. He just accepted it. And that, more than anything, surprised her. Later that evening, they found themselves alone again. The building had emptied. The city lights glowed outside, and the weight of everything they hadn't resolved still lingered between them. But something else had started to form, a fragile space, where honesty could exist, even if it was incomplete. I used to think I knew you completely, Laura said quietly, still looking at her laptop. James leaned against the table, watching her. And now? She paused, then closed the laptop slowly. Now I think I only knew the version of you that you let me see. The words were calm, but they carried depth. James looked down briefly. That version was real. She studied him. I'm sure it was. A pause, but so is this one. And that was the hardest part, because it meant the man she loved and the man who hurt her were the same person. James stepped closer, his voice lower now. I didn't plan for things to get like this. Laura let out a small breath. No one ever does. Silence followed. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with something fragile, something uncertain, something that almost felt like understanding. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. And for once, that sounded honest. Laura looked at him. Good. A beat. Because I'm not ready to. Again, honest, but not harsh. They stood there, only a few feet apart now, closer than they had been in days, and yet, still separated by everything that had happened. I did love you, James said quietly. The words came out before he could stop them, past tense. That was what hurt. Laura's expression shifted, just slightly. I know. She didn't ask if he still did, and he didn't say it, because some truths were too complicated to speak out loud. The moment stretched, delicate, dangerous, almost like it could break at any second. Then Laura stepped back, creating space again, not out of rejection, but out of self-protection. We should focus on the company, she said, her tone returning to something more controlled, more distant. James nodded slowly. Right. Because that was safer, easier, less painful. But something had changed, even if neither of them fully understood it yet. That night, as they left the building together, the air outside felt cooler, lighter, but also uncertain. They walked side by side in silence, not touching, not speaking, but not completely disconnected either. For the first time since everything began to fall apart, there was something between them that wasn't just pain. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to possibility. And that was what made everything that came next even more devastating. Sometimes, things don't break slowly. They shatter all at once. It happened on a night that was supposed to be important, critical, decisive. The company had finally secured a meeting with the very people threatening to destroy it, Harper and Company. If this negotiation failed, everything James had built would begin to collapse for real. And this time, there would be no recovering it. The conference room was prepared hours in advance, documents aligned, presentations ready, every detail accounted for, because James didn't leave things to chance, not in business, not in war. Laura stood near the window, reviewing final notes, her posture calm but focused. She had stepped fully into this role now, not as his wife, but as his equal, maybe even his strongest ally. James watched her from across the room. There was something different about the way she carried herself now, stronger, sharper, untouchable in a way he had never noticed before. Or maybe he had just never looked closely enough. They'll try to pressure us into a weak position, she said without turning. I know, James replied. They'll push for control. They won't get it. She finally looked at him. You can't out-control people who don't care what they destroy. A pause. Then, you have to outthink them. James held her gaze, and for a moment, he listened, really listened. Then we'll do it your way, he said. It wasn't just strategy. It was trust. And that meant something. The meeting began. Executives from Harper & Co. entered with quiet confidence, the kind that came from knowing they already had the upper hand. Introductions were brief, polite, strategic. Then the real conversation started. "We're offering stability," one of their representatives said smoothly. "In exchange for majority control," James replied. "Temporary control," the man corrected. Laura leaned forward slightly. "There's no such thing as temporary control in acquisitions like this." Her tone was calm, but precise, sharp enough to cut through their narrative. The man smiled faintly. "You're well informed." "I'm prepared," she replied. The room shifted subtly, because now they saw her, not as background, not as support, but as a force. For a moment, it looked like they might actually turn things around, like strategy would win, like control could be regained, until the door opened. Every head turned, and in that single moment, everything broke. Vanessa stood in the doorway, uninvited, unannounced, unavoidable. James froze, completely, because this wasn't part of the plan. Laura's eyes moved from Vanessa to James, and in that instant, she understood everything. Not just the affair, but the timing, the overlap, the lies, all of it. "I think I'm in the right place," Vanessa said, her voice calm, but carrying something dangerous underneath. One of the Harper executives stood. "And you are?" Vanessa smiled slightly. "I'm the complication no one accounted for." James stood up quickly. "This isn't the time." "No," Vanessa interrupted, stepping further into the room. "It's exactly the time." The room fell into a tense silence, because whatever this was, it was about to explode. Vanessa's eyes moved to Laura, and for a brief second, there was something almost like recognition, not of who Laura was as a person, but of what she represented. The wife, the truth. Then she looked back at James. "You told me it didn't mean anything," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes, not calm at all. James's jaw tightened. "We'll talk about this later." "No," Vanessa said, her voice sharper now. "There is no later." The Harper executives exchanged glances, because this was leverage. Unexpected, perfectly timed. "You've been lying to both of us," Vanessa continued. "And I'm done pretending I'm okay with that." Laura didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react outwardly. But inside, something was collapsing, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. "You said she didn't matter anymore," Vanessa added. And that was the line that shattered everything. James's eyes flickered toward Laura, just for a second. But it was enough, because Laura saw it. The hesitation, the truth, and suddenly, all the quiet strength she had built, all the control, all the distance, it cracked. She stood up slowly, every movement controlled, every step deliberate. The entire room watched her, waiting, expecting something emotional, something explosive. But what they got was something far worse. Laura looked at James, not with anger, not with tears, but with something that felt like the complete absence of both. "You said that?" she asked, her voice quiet. Too quiet. James opened his mouth, but no words came out, because there was no version of the truth that wouldn't destroy everything. "That I didn't matter?" she continued, still calm, still steady. Vanessa stepped back slightly now, because even she hadn't expected this kind of silence, this kind of controlled devastation. "Laura," James started, but she cut him off. "Don't." One word, sharp, final. The room held its breath. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then Laura nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "Thank you," she said. The words didn't make sense. Not to anyone else in the room, but to her. They meant everything, because now, there was no doubt left, no illusion, no hope clinging to uncertainty, just truth. Clear, brutal, final. She turned and walked out of the room, without another word, without looking back. James stood there, frozen, because in that moment, he felt it, fully, for the first time. Loss. Real. Irreversible. "Seems like you have bigger problems than negotiations," one of the Harper executives said calmly. And just like that, the meeting was over. Everything James had tried to control, everything he thought he could manage, collapsed in a single moment. Vanessa stood there for a second longer, then shook her head slightly. "I guess I finally understand," she said quietly. James didn't respond, didn't move, didn't react, because his world had just fallen apart. Outside the building, Laura walked without direction, her steps steady, her breathing controlled, but inside, everything was unraveling. She didn't cry. Not yet, because sometimes pain is too big for tears. Back in the empty conference room, James finally sat down. Slowly, he stared at nothing, said nothing, did nothing, because for the first time in his life, he had no control, no solution, no way to fix what he had broken, and deep down, a terrifying realization settled in. He hadn't just lost the company, he had lost her. Completely. Silence has a way of revealing truths that noise can hide. 3 weeks passed, and everything changed. The headlines came first. Miller Industries faces collapse after failed negotiation. Leadership crisis raises questions about James Miller's future. Harper & Co. moves closer to acquisition. James didn't read them. He didn't need to. He could feel it. In every unanswered call, every delayed response, every board member who suddenly looked at him differently. Respect had turned into doubt. Control had turned into uncertainty. And power had begun to slip. The board meeting was brief. Too brief. They've made their decision, one member said. James didn't react. Not outwardly. What kind of decision? A pause. Then, "You're stepping down." The words landed quietly, but they carried weight, finality. James leaned back in his chair. For a moment, everything inside him stilled. No anger, no argument, no fight. Just acceptance, because deep down, he knew this was coming. When, he asked, effective immediately. Another pause. They're offering you a transitional role. Advisory. Not leadership, not control. Just presence. A shadow of what he used to be. James nodded once. Fine. Because for the first time, he had nothing left to hold on to. Meanwhile, Laura's life was moving in a completely different direction. She stood in a new office, same building, different floor, different view, different reality. Congratulations, her father said, his voice carrying quiet pride. You didn't just save the company, you reshaped it. Laura didn't smile, not fully, but there was something in her expression now, something steady, something grounded. Someone had to make the decisions no one else wanted to make. And now you're the one leading them. She nodded slightly, because that was the truth. After the collapse of negotiations, Laura had stepped in. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically. She leveraged connections, restructured leadership, rebuilt investor confidence. And in doing so, she became the one person the company couldn't function without. James had built the empire, but Laura saved it, and now she was in charge. The first time James walked back into the building after everything, it felt different. Not just because of what had happened, but because of what he had become. People still recognized him, but they didn't look at him the same way. There was no quiet awe, no subtle admiration, just acknowledgement, and something else, distance. He walked through the halls slower than before, not because he had time, but because he didn't have purpose. When he reached the executive floor, he hesitated, just for a moment, because this part of the building used to belong to him. Now, it belonged to her. He knocked once. Professional, controlled. Come in. Laura's voice, calm, steady, unfamiliar in this context. James opened the door, and there she was, sitting behind the desk that used to be his, composed, focused, unshaken. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Laura gestured slightly. Have a seat. Formal, distant, clear. James sat down. The chair felt different from this side, lower, smaller. I reviewed your advisory proposal, she said, looking down at the document. Her tone was neutral, professional, nothing personal. And, he asked. She looked up, met his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, there was something there. Not anger, not pain, but something deeper, something resolved. It's acceptable, she said. Acceptable. Not impressive, not necessary, just acceptable. James nodded once. Understood. Silence followed. But this silence was heavier than anything before, because now, everything had reversed. He was no longer the man in control, no longer the decision maker, no longer the one she depended on. Now, he was the one asking, and she was the one deciding. I'll expect full transparency moving forward, Laura added, her tone firm, professional. No surprises. James swallowed slightly. Of course. Another pause. Then something shifted, not in the room, but in him. For weeks, he had been reacting, avoiding, surviving, but now, sitting across from her, seeing what she had become, understanding what he had lost, something inside him finally broke open. Laura, Her name felt different on his lips now. Heavier, more honest. She didn't respond immediately, but she didn't stop him either. I was wrong. The words came out quietly, without defense, without justification. And for the first time, they were real. Laura held his gaze, studying him. Not as his wife, not as someone who once loved him, but as someone deciding whether his words meant anything at all. That's not new information, she said. Calm, sharp, honest. James nodded. I know. A beat, but I've never said it like this before. She leaned back slightly, still watching him, still measuring. I didn't just make a mistake, he continued. I made a choice. The air shifted, because that was truth. And that choice cost me everything, he added. Laura's expression didn't soften, but something in her eyes changed, just slightly. Not everything, she said quietly. James frowned. You still have your life, she continued. Your career. Your future. A pause. You just don't have me anymore. The words landed softly, but they carried finality, and for the first time, James didn't try to argue, didn't try to fix it, didn't try to control the outcome, because he understood. This wasn't something he could demand or rebuild overnight. This was something he had to accept. I know, he said. And in that moment, he made a choice, not out of desperation, not out of fear, but out of something real. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. A pause. But I want to earn the chance to become someone who deserved you in the first place. Silence filled the room. Laura looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, she didn't see the man who betrayed her. She saw someone trying to face himself, but that didn't mean everything was fixed. It just meant something had finally begun. I don't know if that's possible, she said honestly. James nodded. But I'm willing to find out, he replied. Not asking, not demanding, just offering. Laura didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't a decision she could make quickly. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about truth, time, and whether something broken could ever be rebuilt. Focus on your role, she said finally, her tone returning to something more controlled. We'll see what happens. Not rejection, not acceptance, but something in between. A possibility, and sometimes, that's where real change begins. James stood up slowly. For a moment, it felt like there was more to say, but there wasn't, because the rest would have to be proven, not spoken. As he walked toward the door, he paused briefly, then left. And for the first time since everything fell apart, he didn't feel like he was running away. He felt like he was finally walking towards something real, even if it cost him everything to get there. Time doesn't fix everything, but it reveals what's real and what isn't. 6 months later, the city looked the same, but their lives didn't. Miller Industries was no longer struggling. It was thriving. Stronger than before, more stable, more intentional. And at the center of it was Laura. She stood in the same office James once controlled, but it didn't feel like his anymore. It didn't even feel like something she had taken from him. It felt like something she had built, earned, defined on her own terms. Her leadership style was different. Where James had controlled, she listened. Where he commanded, she collaborated. Where he avoided emotion, she understood it, and that made all the difference. Your 10 a.m. is here, her assistant said. Laura nodded. Send him in. The door opened, and James walked in. He looked different, not drastically, but noticeably. Simpler suit, less sharp edges, less armor. But the biggest change wasn't visible. It was in the way he carried himself, humbler, quieter, present. Good morning, he said. Morning, Laura replied. No tension, no sharpness, but not familiarity either. Something new, something balanced. James took a seat across from her, not the same chair he once owned, but the one he had learned to accept. I reviewed the expansion report, he said, sliding a file toward her. Laura opened it, read through it carefully. You caught the supply risk, she said. I missed it before. A small admission, but a real one. Laura nodded slightly. Good work. The words were simple, professional, but they carried something more, respect. And James felt it, because this time, he had earned it. They worked through the meeting with ease, clear communication, no tension, no hidden weight. And when it ended, neither of them rushed to leave. There was no urgency anymore, just space. I heard you turned down another executive offer, Laura said. James leaned back slightly. I did. Why? A small pause. Because I'm not done learning here. Honest, simple, real. Laura studied him for a moment. And because of me, she asked. The question wasn't emotional. It was direct. James didn't hesitate. Yes. No explanation. No overthinking. Just truth. Laura looked away briefly. Processing. Not rejecting. Not accepting. Just feeling. Because despite everything, something still existed between them. Not the same love. Not the same connection. But something quieter, stronger, built not on illusion, but on truth. Weeks passed. Then months. Consistency replaced uncertainty. James showed up. Every day, not to prove something loudly, not to demand recognition, but to rebuild, slowly, quietly, through actions, not words. And Laura noticed, even when she didn't say it, until one evening. Everything came full circle. The same restaurant. The one from that night. The one where everything started to fall apart. Laura stood outside, looking at it. Not with pain, but with something softer. Memory. James approached slowly, stopping a few steps behind her. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said. She didn't turn immediately. I wasn't sure either. Honest, she finally faced him. For a moment, neither spoke, because they both remembered the choices, the silence, the betrayal, all of it, but also everything that came after. I used to think this place meant something special, Laura said quietly. James nodded. It still does, he replied. A pause. Just not in the same way. She studied him. And what does it mean now? He took a breath. It's where I made the worst decision of my life. Truth. Unfiltered. But it's also where I learned what that decision cost me. Laura's expression softened slightly. And what did it cost you? She asked. James looked at her, not avoiding, not hiding. You. The word lingered between them, heavy, but no longer destructive, because now it was understood, not denied. Laura exhaled slowly. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she stepped closer. Not all the way, but enough. Do you regret it? She asked. James didn't hesitate. Every day. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real. Laura held his gaze, and something inside her shifted, not instantly, not completely, but enough. Regret doesn't fix things, she said softly. I know. Another pause, but change does. That made her look at him differently, because for the first time, he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was showing growth, and that mattered more than anything he could say. Laura looked at the restaurant one more time, then back at him. I'm not the same person I was, she said. I know, and I won't go back to that version of myself. James nodded. I wouldn't want you to. A small silence. Then, but maybe, she continued slowly. We can figure out who we are now. Not a promise, not a guarantee, but something real. A beginning. James let out a quiet breath. That's more than I deserve. Laura shook her head slightly. It's not about what you deserve. A pause. It's about what I choose. And for the first time, that choice felt entirely hers. She stepped forward, not into his arms, not into the past, but into something new. And this time, James didn't rush it, didn't assume, didn't take it for granted. He just stood there, present, grateful, changed. Because love, the real kind, isn't just about finding someone. It's about becoming someone worthy of them. And sometimes, that only happens after you lose everything. Have you ever lost someone you loved because of a choice you made and wished you could go back and change it? Share in the comments. I read everyone. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. I truly hope you enjoyed every moment of it. There are many more powerful and emotional stories waiting for you here on Mr. Leo's Endless Stories. Just click on the video showing on your screen right now to continue with another beautiful story you won't want to miss.